as we speak, and over the course of the past number of years, our democracy has been stolen away from us, I would say piece by piece, state by state. And here to talk about that with us now is John Nichols. John is a national correspondent for The Nation magazine. He is the author of a number of excellent books, and we like to think he's a good friend of this program. So first of all, John, thanks for coming on the show.
I am a good friend of the program. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Good to have you. And you wrote an article, I thought, I always enjoy reading your stuff, but you wrote a piece recently on why Democrats should become the Anti-Gerrymandering party, which I thought was excellent. So I wanted to talk to you about that. Briefly, what was the thesis, what, in your own words, what that piece was telling us?
It's a very interesting thing. I've been covering politics for a very long time, Richard, probably almost as long as you. And
longer.
As I travel around the country, I always have an ear open for the complaint. The thing that people care about, but maybe isn't the central issue on television or the central issue on radio or wherever else, the internet, wherever people, wherever the elites tend to define a conversation. I listen to what people are saying, after you've given a speech or in the Q&A or kind of just in conversation. And now, historically, nobody's liked gerrymandering, the process by which politicians draw districts that they are essentially assured of winning, grouping their partisan supporters into specific areas and then isolating others in other areas. Historically, people didn't like it, but it wasn't the first thing that came up, or even high on the list of priorities. In the last couple of years, I have heard more and more ardent objection to gerrymandering as people have become increasingly conscious that this process denies us not just competitive elections, but representative democracy. And when you combine the reality of gerrymandering with the reality of an electoral college, which can allow a loser in the popular vote to become president, with the reality of Voting Rights Act diminution and voter suppression, with the reality of money in politics, you end up with a situation where an awfully lot of people are increasingly certain that the democracy deck is stacked against them. Mm-hmm. So what I argue in this piece is that if I'm right, if this is something that people really are caring more and more about and that they're becoming more and more conscious of, the Democratic Party that does such a lousy job of identifying itself and identifying what it stands for might, for both practical and political purposes, sort of pull the brakes on a lot of the stuff it's doing and say, no, we ought to be the party of radical reform. We ought to be the party that says, if we are given power, we will make this country's democracy work. And that's not to suggest that you would diminish any other position, push anything else aside. Of course, you're for health care and education and all the other good things. Of course, you don't like Donald Trump. But there's this sort of higher order call to action, which I actually think the Democrats need at this point. So I wrote an article making that case.
Well, and here's why I really loved what you had to say, John. First of all, I've been sort of nibbling around the edges of this issue for a while. I wrote a piece back in November or December while Democrats are talking about Russians, our democracy is being stolen by Republicans. And frankly, when it comes to gerrymandering, it's not just Republicans, although Republicans are the worst offenders. But I love your idea for a couple reasons. One is I think you're right. I think people intuit or know that the deck is stacked against them, to use your words. Two, I agree with you that Democrats need an overarching theme, a kind of higher purpose that ties everything together, that tells people what they stand for, not just politically, but morally and ethically. And, it's outrageous what's being done out there with gerrymandering. And to be fair, not just gerrymandering, but also voter suppression in various ways, voter ID laws, things like that. And I guess the other reason why I think the Democrats should follow your advice on this is because I think, you write about Chris Kobach and Donald Trump's quote unquote voter fraud commission that's going to pretend that a non-existent problem with people voting dishonestly is a real problem so that they can suppress even more votes. I think that if the Democrats don't make the case for what's really wrong with the system that people know is wrong, that leaves an opening for the Republicans to fill that space with falsehood. Do you agree with that?
Totally. In fact, I think this is the bottom line on all this stuff. When we talk about gerrymandering, the Electoral College, money in politics, voter suppression, all of these things, when we put all these things together, of course we are concerned about these issues as individual concerns. The problem of gerrymandering, the problem of voter suppression. But at the heart of it is this question of whether democracy will work, whether we can have a representative democracy. And if the answer to that question is no, if that can't be made real, then the prospect that our organizing, our energy, our activism is going to transform this thing, is going to really provide the economic, social, political answers for the 21st century is greatly diminished. It becomes much harder. And so we're not really talking merely about electoral structures or political processes here. We're talking about policy. We're talking about whether it's possible to do big, great things. And my argument is that for too long, the Democratic Party has compromised on that. They've said, well, we can win on the margins. We can win narrowly simply by saying we're not as bad as the other guys. And often that works, no doubt about it. But we're in a period right now where there are so many fundamental issues at play, and where so many of them have gone unaddressed, that people really are frustrated. And that frustration is going to take us in one of two directions: toward deeper democracy, toward really creating a representative system where the will of the people is reflected in our governance situation, where of course we get single-payer Medicare for all health care because it's the only logical answer for the great mass of people. Of course we have free education as far as you can go because it's the only logical answer for the great mass of people. But that's deep democracy. That's making the whole thing work and making it functional. The alternative is a much more authoritarian response, one that says, well, the people have some ideas, but they're just not possible. There really is no alternative to a neoliberal economics, a neoconservative foreign policy, austerity for the many, tax cuts for the few. And I'm going to tell you, if that's where we end up, right, people are going to hate it. They hate that circumstance. And they're always going to be looking for somebody with an answer. And you're going to get your Donald Trumps in there. You may also get a progressive response sometimes too. But you're never likely to get to a real solution. I argue that the road to a real solution is through deep democracy. And that the Democrats, for both, again, moral and also practical reasons, it's popular, ought to buy into and go for deep democracy, take that chance. I don't know that they will, but I will tell you that, in my view, if they don't, they run the risk of facilitating their opposition.
Well, I agree with virtually everything you said, John Nichols. And again, John is the Washington correspondent for The Nation. The one, I think you were a bit too kind in saying that it does work from time to time for Democrats to reach out to swingable Republicans. It hasn't worked much lately. It used to work, but they've lost all three branches of the federal government, 2/3 of state houses, all that stuff, 2/3 of governorships. So they do need something new, and I think this is a chance, right? This is a chance to do it. I also wanted to add that and get your thoughts on the irony here is that while it hasn't worked to appeal to reasonable Republicans on economic grounds, this is and you understand far better than I what the poll numbers say here, but this strikes me as something that you could reach Republicans on, that they would respond to something that says, look, it's not fair whether Democrats or Republicans jury rig districts. It's just not the Democratic, small d, it's not the American way to do things. I think you could get some Republicans just to get behind that, don't you?
I definitely do. And it's a very appealing argument to say, look, the changes that we propose do not guarantee that we'll win every election. We want to throw off the processes that allow the system to be gamed by one party or another, that sometimes have even allowed us to game the system. We want to get rid of that. We want to create a system where the Congress of the United States, the legislatures of our states, really are reflective of the popular will. And Richard, this can sound very idealistic and even somewhat esoteric, but let me give you a practical example of this. In 2012, Democrats won the overall vote for House of Representatives in the United States by 1.4 million votes. They had a 1.4 million vote victory in House races across the country, and yet Republicans ended up with essentially a 30-seat advantage in the House of Representatives. How do you get that? You get that because the process has been gamed, or maybe we'll throw aside the polite word gamed and simply say rigged.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's absolutely right, and I think
and both parties should ultimately both parties should dislike that, because both parties have ended up on the bad end of that equation at different times.
Right. The flip side of that for Republicans, John, is that if you're a moderate Republican, and such beings do exist, although we don't hear a lot about them, you should want this too, because if you live in a jury-rigged, gerrymandered, safe Republican seat, your views no longer matter. You're being shouted out by the Tea Party Freedom Caucus types because they're the ones who are winning the primary. So if you're a reasonable Republican, I would argue this is good for you too.
Well, at the root of this article, of course, is an actual piece of legislation, a bill that was produced by Congressman Don Beyer from Virginia. And his proposal is for a radical restructuring of how we choose members of Congress. What would happen is that in small states, you would have all at-large elections, run all the seats together in a multi-seat district. In big states, say like a California, you'd have a number of these multi-seat districts, maybe 5 members in each of the multi-seat districts. Now, this can start to sound a little complicated, but it's actually not. It's how we choose school boards and city councils, and we do at-large elections all over the place where you have a list of candidates, the ones who get the most votes prevail. But in this model of a multi-candidate district, under the plan that Beyer's put forward, people would be able to rank their favorite candidates, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The candidates with the most votes would prevail, but using a model called ranked choice voting, the candidates who get the least votes, their votes are redistributed to your second, third choices. At the end of the day, what that means is that you can really produce a Congress that, you begin at this district level, multi-seat district level, and then take it up to the federal, where you have a real reflection of where people are at. It also does a couple of other things that are pretty interesting. One, it pretty well guarantees that anywhere in the country, you're going to have both parties winning, right? I mean, one party will have the advantage, but you won't have a situation like we currently have in some states where 30-40% of the people may vote Democratic, but you don't have any Democratic representatives. You see that in a number of Western states. But you also have an advantage for Republicans. In a state like Massachusetts, where 30-40% of people vote Republican, you'd get some Republicans winning. And a final element of this, Richard, which I think is really important, there are cases where independents and third-party candidates would have a much better chance of winning in this system. There are circumstances where women could win seats in areas that have never elected women or rarely elected them, where people of color could target their voting and win seats in areas where they have not won in the past. I mean, there's a lot can come of looking for models to open up our political process. And yes, as you suggest, moderates would be heard. I think there is a good chance that moderates can be heard, but also visionaries on the left and the right.
Absolutely.
On the left and the right will have a better chance of winning in this system.
Yeah, it starts to look a little bit more, although it's not a parliamentary system, it starts to have some of the advantages of a parliamentary system in terms of new parties coming in and entering the process. So, all right, well, very interesting stuff, John Nichols. Again, we'll keep writing if you, I mean, not that you need advice from me, but I would implore you to keep writing about this stuff because I think it's very important. So, John Nichols.
The response, my friend, has been fabulous across the country. I've heard from so many people on it. So, yes, as any writer does, if people like what you're writing, you tend to keep doing it.
Yep. Well, I liked it. So, John Nichols, Washington correspondent for The Nation, thanks for writing such a good piece, and thanks for coming on the program.
Pleasure, my friend.